And then he asked God, who he had lied to protect him. And God protected him. The Bible declares that God put a protection. What a loving, beautiful God to love a murderer so much. So we can study much of the Old Testament. Now there is a period called the period of the law. And the law was given for a specific reason. And I'm kind of appalled that you know so little about the Bible. I'm amazed. You can quote a few favorite verses here and there. We could discuss the jot and tittle verse. You didn't quote that right. You skipped half a sentence. You've got to study the whole thing, what it says. It's not fair to quote a verse and then skip half a sentence. Because you could miss the whole point of that verse that you see. And you did, actually. But let's not even go there. But the law was given. Because what happened after Cain sinned and murdered, God protected him. Then next comes a man called Lamech. He murdered several people. And he said, hey, murder is no big deal. Because look what God did to Cain. God protected Cain. God was so nice. God doesn't care. He says, God, if you help Cain, you'll help me. So in other words, people took sin very lightly. God never wanted to punish people for their sin, though God is holy. It's the teaching of the Bible. But to show people the seriousness of sin, that's why the law was given. God never intended one person to be able to be holy or live right by the Ten Commandments and the law of Moses. The Bible is so clear. The Apostle Paul tells us that in fact the knowledge of the commandments caused them to want to sin more. It was a preparation, and the Jewish people were used as a case study. Though God provided for them, they had access to instant forgiveness of sin anytime they wanted to. Throughout the period of the law. We could go into all of that. Come to our Bible college and I'll teach you about that. About everything from the red heifer to the tabernacle and every kind of provision, so that none would have to perish under the old covenant either. But that whole thing was to show human inability. And you're talking how much the atheists are able to live a good life. In fact, none of us, in thought and deed, we all know that none of us live a perfect life. We all fall. And the gospel is, not that you get saved, get born again, and have a judgmental ghost chase you and monitor every act and thought. But the good news is, that's what the gospel is. The good news is that God took the judgment for human sin and put it on Jesus. That Jesus became our substitute. This is the love story that the world is eating up because it speaks to the wounded human conscience. That's the story. And so, when you are talking about God, and you can bring up, I'm surprised you have these, one word I noticed that you don't like is the word context. But let's be fair. You say Psalm 14:1, the fool says, there's no God, and then Jesus says, don't call anybody fool, you're in danger of hellfire. And I'm surprised you haven't asked me more about hell. I want to talk about that too. The context is important. I think it's fair to say that I could take half a sentence out of any book and misquote it. So, as much as you don't like it to be in context, it's always good when the verse comes under question. For example, I heard you quote a verse where you said that God says, I hate with a perfect hatred. Well, it's kind of easy to answer that verse. I've heard you quote, I create good and evil. I'm surprised you haven't brought that up, because you usually bring that up. You really write on that, Isaiah 45:7. I have got some good things. Read the verse before and read the verse after. To say about that I don't know if anybody ever told you these things. But, don't cherry pick a verse here and there to give a smart comment of half a sentence here and there. Let's look at the total message of God's great love for all of us, especially me.
As you know, I have a whole chapter in my book about context. I do understand context. And it's usually believers, fundamentalist type, those who call themselves Bible believers, who are guilty of the very thing they accuse us atheists of doing, cherry picking. Yes, there are some verses in the Bible that say God is love. But if you look at the Bible in the entire context, on balance, God is not a God of love. You can find a verse that says this or that and harp on that. But it's usually believers. It's usually believers like you who are cherry picking because you have a preconceived idea that God is in fact a God of love. The God that you think you're in love with in your heart and in your mind is a good, loving God. And when I point out that the God of the Bible is brutal, a petty dictator whose vanity is so insecure that he has to kill people forever for not worshiping him correctly. For example, the Ten Commandments. honor the Sabbath, to keep it holy, which is what? God's holiness. God has his Sabbath to keep holy. What happened when somebody did not honor the Sabbath? You know the story in Numbers. They found a man outside the camp who was gathering sticks on the Sabbath. You know that story. So they brought him to Moses and said, Moses, what should we do? He was picking up sticks on Saturday, when the Ten Commandments says you shouldn't do that. What should we do with this man? And Moses thought, and Moses said, this man should be stoned to death. So they took him outside the city, and they stoned that man to death. For what? What was the crime? What in heck was the crime? He probably was wanting to feed his family. He probably cared about his kids. And yet he offended God. God wasn't worshipped right. God was offended in some way. His holiness was hurt. This big creator of the universe is so petty that he'd asked to stone someone to death for violating his command not to do any work on the Sabbath. I bet you work on the Sabbath, whatever day you call that. I bet you've thrown away those verses as irrelevant and ancient and primitive. So, well, okay, maybe so. I bet a lot of your worshipers do. They work on the Sabbath. They have found those verses are irrelevant. Those old laws are irrelevant today. In the teachings of Jesus, Jesus said, don't think that I came to send peace on earth. I came not to send peace, but a sword. He told his disciples, if you don't have a sword, sell your clothes and buy a sword. Jesus said, if you want to be my disciple, then you must hate your family. He used that Greek word miseo. Look at it in context. Look at what the word says. He was like a cult leader who was insecure. He said, he that is not with me is against me. That's a paranoia that these small-time dictators have, which is not true. You can be neutral. Jesus said that if you lose in a lawsuit, pay double. Have any of you ever done that? Have you ever got a speeding ticket and paid double the fine? Why not? Jesus said you should do that. Jesus had very bad moral teachings. Jesus said, he showed how compassionate he was by saying there are some slaves that you ought not to beat as hard as other slaves because they didn't know better. He never once denounced slavery. He incorporated slavery, that brutal institution, into his parables as if it were the normal order of the day. Why didn't he give us some useful advice? Why didn't he say something about the germ theory of disease, like wash your hands before you eat? Why didn't this all-caring, loving God, why did we have to wait for science for 2,000 years to come up with that answer? He was basically useless as a moral teacher. He didn't say anything about women's rights. All his disciples were male. God is a man, and he got a woman pregnant, and she had a son. It was the patriarchal attitude of those days. In Revelations, he says, 144,000 male virgins who have not been defiled with women. They are the ones who will be praising. As if women can defile men. This is ancient idea that the Bible had, and Jesus had, and his disciples had, which is an insult to human nature. Jesus was arrogant, as you even pointed out. He said that I am greater than Solomon. He liked to revel in his greatness and his arrogance. He was angry. He looked at his disciples with anger. He took up a whip and he threatened violence to people who were basically practicing free enterprise, helping people to worship by changing money in the temple. He picked up a whip and was angry at people. If Jesus was our role model, I wouldn't want to live in the same block with him. You and I are much better human beings than Jesus. We are nicer than him. We have better ways of thinking. We have risen above the brutality and the primitiveness and the simplicity. Jesus said, the works that I do, you will do also, and even greater than these. Have any of you done any greater works than Jesus? Of course not. He was irrelevant. He was useless. He was not a good moral leader. And Peter, you should be ashamed to be in love with a man like that. You're better than that. I think you are better than that. Don't use Jesus as your evidence for the existence of God, for which you've given no evidence yet tonight.
Peter's response will be the last of our 5-minute back and forth. We're going to take a 10-minute break, and then we'll come back for some Q&As with our two guests tonight. Peter.
Well, you see, this is how it goes. I just counted here. Mr. Barker raised 15 subjects in that 5 minutes. This is a good debating technique if you don't want any answers. You just want to throw out a lot of questions of a doubt.